In part 1, we learned about how France left World War I victorious with one of the most modern militaries in the world, while at the same time, France was devastated by a loss of manpower, industrial capacity, and the destruction of its lands. Meanwhile, Germany found itself unrivaled in terms of production might, and would eventually seek to escape its obligations under the Treaty of Versailles. At home, meanwhile, France was stretched thin between rebuilding and maintaining its empire across the world. Rebuilding and modernizing the armed forces fell on the back burner. Even still, available manpower simply was not there due to significant losses during World War I. It was only when the leftist Popular Front was elected in the mid-1930s did the French government take modernization of the military seriously, as Paris watched in horror as Hitler rose to power. In preparation, the newly elected Popular Front would invest nearly 25% of its GDP in defense spending alone and begin nationalizing production. But reactionary forces had already taken some hold amongst the French population and the military. Meanwhile, anti-Semitism was beginning to run rampant, especially towards the new Jewish Prime Minister, Léon Blum. You are listening to the Royal Palace Podcast, The Fall of France, Part 2.
Every federal agency to eliminate rules that don't make sense.
It's the usual French talk, stall and surrender.
All scientists, dynamists, are professionals. The cultural soul of the nation.
You Americans have given us
The sense grows very easy. Great again.
Okay, so France is getting closer to war. The Popular Front knows it. They're trying to spend some money on military. Some money, as in 25% of GDP, which is, what does the U.S. spend, guys?
Nothing like that.
A few percent. 4%?
Like 3 or 4, yeah, probably.
Any accusation that they weren't spending money on defense, I think we've debunked.
Yeah. Unfortunately, there was still just the general economic follow-on effects of World War I and the Great Depression, where as a result, overall industrial production across all sectors in France in 1938 was only 75% of what it had been in 1929.
Right, and the U.S. at this time is not doing well.
No, nobody is unless you're working in a German arms plant. A country is run entirely on. They were just turbocharging their economy because they had their own aims and their own timeline, and they were not worried to spend. They were not worried the deficit spend in Nazi Germany.
Why did France and the international community allow this to happen? Right, because it wasn't a secret that the Germans were violating the Treaty of Versailles, right?
Yeah. And this is where I kind of cut out a lot of the more diplomatically focused stuff because we're already going so long here. But yeah, it's worth examining why France was so slavishly tied at the hip to the UK. And the answer is obviously just the grievous damage the country had suffered during World War I, that they did not want to be carrying the consequences of a possible confrontation with Germany on their own. And so at multiple points during this period, the French were much more inclined than the British to intervene. The first time around, this was very soon after Hitler took power. It was actually a Polish initiative to intervene, to have the League of Nations declare that Germany was in violation of its Versailles Treaty obligations and to intervene militarily in Germany. At this time, the Polish army on its own actually dwarfed the German army because of the Versailles Treaty limitations. And so they approached the French, but the French were unwilling to move without the British, and so nothing came of that.
I don't want to go into counterfactuals here, but this could have just avoided the war.
100%. It's infuriating. I have a paper on this. I'll have to send it. It's shocking reading.
And it doesn't make a lot of sense for the French to be taking the British line on this, because the British calculation is all based on them being an island.
Yes, and the British were not as concerned by the Nazi rise to power as the French were. Certain people were. You give credit to Winston Churchill for one thing. Churchill was very at odds with the conservative policy in Britain towards Germany. But in general, and this had been the British policy since basically the end of World War I, is that they wanted Germany as a bulwark against the Soviet Union. They feared much more communism spreading across the European continent than they feared fascism. And they personally bankrolled Mussolini's rise to power. It was revealed not so long ago.
God, history never stops repeating itself, does it?
The British did not have the same level of concern about fascism as the French.
Yeah. Whereas in France, whatever you're concerned about fascism, again, worth reminding everyone that Germany had invaded France twice in the past less than 70 years.
Yeah.
Right? Like, even if you're like a French fascist, I would think you wouldn't love the prospect of another German invasion.
Right. Yeah, I guess two more points where something could have been done here. The first was the remilitarization of the Rhineland, which had been occupied by France after the war, the German territory adjacent to France, and an industrial hub in Germany. Soon after Hitler came to power, he sent German troops into this demilitarized zone, and there were serious calls from a lot of different, from across the French political spectrum to do something about this. But this coincided with the French air minister was on visit to Germany, and Hermann Goering, the obese Luftwaffe drug addict leader of the Nazi Air Force, was showing off the newest German planes in an attempt to intimidate him, which was completely successful. The French realized they had nothing that could compete with the new planes that the Germans were putting in the air, even if they didn't know how many of them they had yet. And this was an area where Britain had an edge. Britain had a much more modern, much larger air force than France did at this time. And the British were unwilling to act. And so the French ultimately did not respond to this provocation either. And then finally you have the infamous Sudetenland crisis and the Munich conference, where, again, led by Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, it was decided to sell out the Czechoslovaks and let Germany annex the most fortified part of their territory, which unfortunately badly discredited the entire French diplomatic strategy during the interwar period, where they had built what was called the Little Entente, where they had armed and trained the militaries of Czechoslovakia, Romania, Poland, with the idea of having an Eastern European counterweight against Germany, and also to have that buffer against the Soviet Union. That the idea was still there.
And where were the Americans in all this? I mean, was the State Department just kind of sitting back and watching?
Not our problem. No, I mean, the U.S. was, in a deeply isolationist current. The Great Depression hit all of these countries, but the U.S. was sort of in a unique position because the French and British could kind of cushion the blow a little bit by using the internal market of the colonial empires, which the U.S. really couldn't do at the time. And then there was just no appetite for it. I mean, it was hard enough to get the U.S. to intervene in one world war. They never joined the League of Nations. And the U.S. military at this time was smaller than that of Portugal. It just completely, and did not have a significant arms manufacturing capacity during the 1920s and 30s. We forget that actually in World War I, the U.S. was heavily dependent on the French and British for armament. A lot of U.S. units that went to France went with wooden rifles. All of the tanks that they used were built by the French and British. All of the aircraft flown by the U.S. in World War I were French aircraft. It's very much a post-World War II phenomenon that the U.S. is this arms manufacturing giant. It's actually pretty interesting that was not the case. So the U.S. was really not in a position to intervene, even if the will had existed.
I mean, that really puts into perspective how remarkable the U.S.'s rapid shift to arms manufacturing was during the war itself, during the first few years of the war.
100%. And again, I think that's kind of like what I was mentioning at the beginning, is that we live so much in the world of post-1945 that I think it's so hard for us to really imagine how different the world was seen at that time, and the way that different countries behaved and how they were perceived.
To make a bigger point about just like a line we have on our podcast, imagine just what the American state had to do in order to get where it needed to be for its intervention.
And then providing huge amounts of armaments to the countries, to Britain, to France, the Soviet Union. It was a state-directed, I forget exactly when it was, but it was as the war was breaking. I think it was probably right after the fall of France, because this completely shocked the U.S. diplomatic establishment, who had viewed France as being the policeman of Europe, was the term that was thrown around a lot in American diplomatic circles at that time. And suddenly, just complete collapse of the previously established balance of power. And that really sparks... I mean, we had peacetime conscription, which the U.S. had never had before. They began drafting people, even though the U.S. was not at war. And massive scale up of war production. I forget what the target was that Roosevelt set, but he wanted something like 15,000 planes a year manufactured, which would eventually be exceeded. But at the time, this was an otherworldly target. I think the U.S. was producing a few hundred aircraft a year when he said that.
Meanwhile, today, the best we can come up with are targets that we know we won't hit and we don't even try.
Yeah, there's no seriousness behind anything we say anymore.
What was, in the years leading up to the war, what was France's relation with the Soviet Union like?
I want to dig into that more. I found there's so much reading to do on that topic. This was another thing where I will say that perfidious Albion really managed to sabotage things badly, although there was a serious internal French debate. But during this whole period, there were a lot of initiatives by the Soviet Union, whose foreign minister at that time was Maxim Litvinov, before the now infamous Molotov. Litvinov was himself Jewish, and had read Mein Kampf and was very conscious of what was happening in Nazi Germany and saw it as a primordial threat to the Soviet Union, to international socialism, and to the Jewish people. And so he was making serious diplomatic initiatives to try to build a common defense pact against Germany. There were receptive figures in France to such a proposal, including Paul Reynaud, who will become the prime minister during 1940. He was a major figure. He was really opposed to appeasement and threatened to resign from multiple governments over the course of these events. So the French did negotiate with the Soviets. The British were less serious in pursuing this. Neville Chamberlain and then the Tories in Britain were very transparent in internal discussions that they still considered the Soviet Union a bigger threat than Nazi Germany. For tripartite talks, they purposely sent a message by sending their emissaries on a very slow boat to Leningrad instead of by plane or train. Literally, I could find the paper. It's pretty crazy. But the other major obstacle was that Poland was completely unwilling to play ball because they had fought a war with... The Soviet Union hadn't existed at the time, but with Soviet Russia in 1920, and so they were unwilling to make any compromises with the Soviets. The Czechs, Czechoslovaks, I think, were also kind of skeptical, and so ultimately this effort faltered. Stalin lost patience, eventually sacked Litvinov, who became ambassador to the United States, where he would remain during World War II, and replaced him with Molotov, who he instructed to cut a deal with Nazi Germany, which he infamously did. That's a rough and dirty sketch of what was going on there. I'd love to go back into that in the future somehow.
I mean, as with all these things with this period, it just, you can't help but think constantly of the many ways that this could have been avoided.
Yep.
The whole thing.
Yep.
The Holocaust, the many, many millions of people who died.
It's awful.
But it wasn't, and it started with the fall of Poland, but then soon after that, you had the fall of France. So let's get into that.
So soon after the German invasion of Poland, September 1939, you have the UK and France finally taking their treaty obligations to a country seriously after allowing Czechoslovakia to be dismembered. They declare war. France mobilizes 4.2 million men. And here's where we start to see the problems. Of these 4.2 million men, 1/3 of them were over 40, which is not ideal for a fighting army.
Sounds like the Ukrainian army today.
Yeah.
Well, and that's doing fine, so what's the problem?
Only 600,000 of these 4.2 million men were under the age of 25. 500,000 of them were World War I veterans.
My God.
So ultimately, most of these men over 40 had to be dismissed, except for officers of the reserve.
This would be like if kids who fought in Iraq were going back to Iraq today.
Yeah, it's crazy to think about, and it really shows like what a desperate state they were in terms of manpower, and just what a insane, egregious wound that World War One had inflicted on this country.
What does the same thing look like on the German side? Like, are they able to send young men?
Yeah, so I would need to dig into this, and it's really disputed why this is the case. It was already the case before World War One that France just had a remarkably low fertility rate, much lower than other European countries.
Probably that seed oil.
I mean, France has been in relative decline for centuries. They used to be overwhelmingly the British. Yeah, they used to be many times bigger than the UK, and they ended up around the same size.
Yeah, there's a lot of different theories about why that's the case. Some credit the inheritance system, which apparently discourages large families. Others say it's because of the revolution and having a relatively more liberated atmosphere for women, which was true on and off, I guess. It's not really clear why. But so even going into World War One, the French population was growing a lot slower than the Germany's, especially, but other European countries. And then, of course, you have just a massive culling of the population of young men, so the population deficit is just enormous. On the German side, it was just not the case. Obviously, a comparable number of German men were killed in World War One, but they had much stronger population growth in the years leading up to it, so the generation that succeeded them was far larger.
Germany in 1939, including annexed Austria and the Czech Republic, had 86 million people, which is pretty close to Germany's population today. In fact, it's more. France, on the other hand, had 42.
There you go. So France could draw on its colonies for indigenous manpower, but yeah, they were effectively outnumbered by the Germans. And it didn't have an impact here when the Nazis were psychotically committed to high birth rate. You know, they would hand out medals to women for having more kids. They tried to get women out of the workforce as much as possible, and only late in the war did they finally start reversing that out of necessity. Obviously, none of those kids would grow up in time to participate in the war, but still.
But one of the many creepy things, you hear about Nazi Germany at first, and you're like, oh, that sounds fine. And then you look into it, and you're like, wow, these guys were...
It's pretty weird, and that's without getting into the weird SS breeding camps, which we'll leave aside. Although this birth rate stuff you do hear all the time now.
You hear it, but you don't get what they were actually doing. I think a lot of things today are much more like Mussolini than they are like Hitler. Like, Hitler was pretty unique. I don't think we've seen anything like that since. We see a lot of people who could easily be Mussolini if they were able to, right? Like,
I'm inclined to agree with that.
Mussolini didn't have a lot of strong positions. He just sort of went with what worked. He definitely didn't have the Nazi elite's just psychotic commitment to some really weird things. Like,
yeah, and you could say the same about Franco, right?
Yeah, definitely, exactly. And the fascist regimes, Spain, Portugal, Italy, were much more ideologically nebulous than Nazi Germany was, which worked out well for. That's why Spain and Italy managed to stay fascist into the 70s, because they sort of decided that fascism kind of meant whatever was convenient for it to mean.
All right, so plowing back in, I guess, a quick sketch of what the French army looked like in 1939. So in the first 3 weeks of September, they were able to call up 65 divisions. So that's roughly 8 to 12,000 men each. 10 of those were deployed along the Italian border. You had 40 tank battalions. Tank battalion in the French army at that time being between 32 and 36 tanks, depending on the machine. Those were each split up and would be in support of the infantry divisions. They weren't concentrated together into tank units. They did have 2 armored divisions, and that's where the big hulking heavy tanks that they were manufacturing in the newly nationalized factories were concentrated. But all of these were short on different weapons and weapon systems to different degrees. I'll get into some of the numbers here, but it's pretty crazy. Got to highlight that the French Air Force was just in shambles. They only had enough pilots to fly half of their planes, which is pretty incredible. So they had 439 fighters, 359 bombers at the start of the war. Nearly all of them completely obsolescent, slower, more cumbersome, less reliable than the German planes, and the French pilots just got they got handled very roughly. And you've got really serious shortages of different types of equipment. Almost no anti-aircraft weaponry, which will become a serious problem. In 1939, there was a 93% deficit of anti-aircraft guns due to problems with the factories that were being nationalized. Serious shortage of anti-tank weapons. So the 55th Division, which would hold the Sedan sector along the Meuse, along the border with the Belgian Ardennes, but still an area that will become very important very soon. They had 10,000 men and a single anti-tank gun to defend the city of Sedan, and which is absurd. And so because of these production shortfalls, it became necessary to immediately recall 180,000 men from this army that was already lacking manpower to work in the armaments factories. And so you actually have pretty spectacular efforts by the armaments ministers, a minister named Raoul Dautry. He requisitioned factories, he used military manpower, and by April 1940, production had increased pretty dramatically, but you still had a lot of divisions reporting serious shortages of anti-tank weapons. You still had tank units that didn't have as many vehicles as they were meant to, and the army still didn't have enough boots. Serious boot shortage that was never corrected during the 9 months.
You don't mean boots figuratively in terms of people, soldiers. You mean actual boots,
like their actual shoes. They didn't have enough shoes. Yeah, they had serious issues during the winter of 1939. It was an incredibly cold, rainy winter, temperatures dropping below zero, lots of guys getting frostbite injuries just because they didn't have enough winter clothing and shoes. It was actually
that feels like a Napoleonic War era problem to have, not something that should have been happening in the middle of the 20th century, like in a modern industrialized country.
It's pretty shocking. And it really contributed to, during this period in 1939 that we refer to as the phony war, that the French refer to as the drôle de guerre, when the army was mobilized, it was sitting in its immense border fortifications, and it was doing basically nothing.
And so was it because of this, this problem of having invested so much in border fortifications, they didn't want to enter German territory, or is it more like a...
So there was an abortive attempt to intervene, because the idea was that, Germany was invading Poland, so it was now a two-front war. So to relieve pressure on Poland, they send some of the couple active duty units that were already mobilized at the start of the war across the Saar River into German territory near the city of Saarbrücken, in what became known as the Saar Offensive. But the collapse of Poland was so rapid that this was quickly abandoned. The French army never penetrated more than a couple dozen kilometers into German territory, and that because the Germans had foreseen this event, the whole area was heavily landmined. There were almost no battles fought during this offensive, but a terrible number of French guys had their feet blown off by landmines, which they had really no equipment to detect or disarm at that point in time. So ultimately they would end up falling back behind the French border by October of 1939, where they would stay. And basically because of the shortages of equipment, because they knew that they especially had an inferiority in air power, and because they wanted to wait for the British army to deploy in France to support them, they kind of were committed to sitting back and waiting for the Germans to launch the first blow.
What was the status at this time of French overseas troops? Because you said before, 40% of French troops were deployed in the colonies?
Yeah.
Were these rapidly withdrawn to the metropole?
Yep, which took a lot of time, obviously. And they were also, actively recruiting new colonial units to supplement the French army because of the manpower issues. So they were raising a lot of troops in Morocco, in West Africa, bringing these men to France, training them, equipping them. So because they had to kind of concentrate a force from the overseas territories, which took several months, they weren't really prepared to take too serious of an action right off the bat in the first couple months of the war.
Why hadn't they done this earlier?
Good question. I honestly am a bit mystified sometimes. I mean, you had, again, yes, massive surge in defense expenditures in 1939, obviously in anticipation of conflict with Germany. It's a bit mystifying why there were no mobilization measures taken in the months prior to the war. There was partial mobilization in the months of July and August, but that was just to kind of start getting units stood up. They weren't at all combat ready.
How did the colonies themselves take to the idea of France going to war?
Good question. I don't feel equipped to answer, to be honest. The only thing I can point out is there's one unique case, which is Morocco, which was under French colonial domination, but had a protectorate status. So it was all through a treaty with the Sultan of Morocco. And so as a result, that was the only colony where all of the troops that came from Morocco were volunteers. A lot of them volunteered because it just happened that during this time Morocco was having serious droughts and famine in the countryside. So a lot of families, in order to survive, were sending their sons to volunteer for the French army, so they could send back whatever pay a colonial soldier got. But yeah, that's kind of an interesting edge case there. Otherwise, I believe the recruitment at least in West Africa, was usually done through intermediaries where, like you were kind of saying in the Aloka Ferry case, a territory being colored in on the map doesn't mean that effective control necessarily expands over that whole territory, right? And that was a good point that you guys made. And so they would actually kind of give quotas to traditional leaders, like different tribal authorities in these areas, to bring them a certain number of healthy men each year for conscription, and that was how that was usually handled.
Feels very Game of Thrones, that.
Yeah, very, very feudal. Yeah. To tell us about the what the British strategy was during this phony war, they were deploying troops to. Were they fully committed deploying their forces to France?
Yeah, so the British Expeditionary Force started. Where do I have notes about that? As I have the exact numbers.
I mean, you say 152,000 troops. If the Versailles Treaty was respected, Britain alone could have crushed them.
Yeah, but I think let's remember also 152,000 British troops in the BEF compared to France mobilized 4.2 million in 1939. And this ended up being a really consistent point of friction. That in World War I, when Britain sent the expeditionary force to France and Belgium, it was, even in 1914, over 1 million men. And the French were really understandably frustrated that the British were not contributing a major force. They contributed something like 4 divisions that were active duty. And they were also suffering serious equipment shortages. Like I mentioned how the French were short on anti-tank guns and anti-aircraft guns. The French had to give anti-tank guns to the British units because they didn't have enough. The British Army had suffered serious budget cuts during the 20s and 30s because they're an island. The Navy and Air Force got massively preferential treatment for budgeting and procurement, and the British Army was an afterthought, and so they were not remotely prepared in 1940 and 1939 and 40 to field a large force. A question I can't answer, I'm curious about, is why then didn't Britain also lean on its colonies for manpower? Millions of Indians fought in the Western Front during World War I. I don't know why that didn't occur in 1939. It'll have to be another point of research for me. But
I don't know if the Japanese threat was something they were worried about yet at that point.
That is true. They were actively building up in Malaya. But the British did have a relatively modern air force, much more modern than the French, at least. But because they were afraid of German retaliation, they were unwilling to use their bombers against German targets in 1939. So while Germany was invading Poland, the British Air Force was dropping leaflets over German cities rather than attempting to bomb war industries. And they refused to send a large portion of this Air Force to France because they held most of their planes back for home defense. So the Royal Air Force units that were sent to France, which were more modern and capable than the French Air Force, were still not equipped with the most modern British aircraft. They didn't have the famous Spitfires. Those were all being held back in Britain to defend against potential German air raids, which didn't come until France had already collapsed. So basically the idea, the timeline was that the French Supreme Commander, Maurice Gamelin, who I guess for context, he had commanded a division in World War I. And funny enough, his style of command is actually somewhat comparable to Pétain, in that they were both really well liked by their men because they were very cautious, because they would bite off they wouldn't launch these grand offensives and send waves of men over rushing to get cut down by machine guns like the French generals did in the first years of the war. They were pretty smart about using artillery, firepower, and tanks to gain superiority in a small area and just kind of biting off little chunks and making these tactical advances that moved the front line slowly but were more efficient in terms of casualties. Gamelin, in contrast to Pétain, was a very politically neutral figure, very kind of scholarly academic. He made all the circuits within the war college in the 20s and 30s. And so naturally, when the Popular Front was looking for a general to replace Weygand as the top general in the French army, they landed on Gamelin because he was inoffensive and unthreatening politically. More of a thinker than a doer, unfortunately, is what we see. He believed that basically, given the strong defensive posture that the French had and the border fortifications of the Maginot Line, that they were relatively safe from German attack. They could weather whatever initial blow the Nazis could throw at them, and that they could outproduce Germany and gain a material upper hand by 1941 or 1942. And then the plan was that they would launch an offensive on a secondary front, expecting that Italy would enter the war. They assumed that they would invade Italy from the north, and then once they'd finally kind of whittled down the fascist forces, they would launch a final offensive into the Rhineland and the Ruhr Valley and knock Germany out of the war. And naturally, they expected the German blow to come not so much against the Maginot Line, because that was a strong deterrent, but to come down as it had in World War I, through Belgium, across the Belgian plain, which is flat, open country, good for driving tanks across. And so they moved the best French and British units, most of their tanks, all of their kind of motorized infantry units, which benefited from trucks and half-tracks and different vehicles, over to the border with Belgium to rapidly move north and to meet the Germans around the city of Namur, where they expected the main blow to come. And as we know, that did not, in fact, happen in the end. On the German side, there was actually... the generals were not confident on the German side in their ability to deliver a knockout blow. When you read some of the texts on this period, it's interesting that the attitude of the German generals is often described as strategic fatalism, that they thought that the material balance of forces favored the Allies, who had a greater combined industrial capacity, who had their colonial empires, and they didn't believe that they could knock France out of the war in one blow. The original plan they had was exactly the plan that the Allies anticipated, to swing through Belgium and to seize Paris. It was recognized that this was quite predictable, and there was actually an incredible incident where a German pilot carrying with an officer as a passenger who was carrying these plans actually crashed in neutral Belgium in 1939.
Oh,
the plans
right.
were captured by the Belgians, transmitted to the Allies, and so the Germans, in a panic, realized they needed to revise their plans. The Allies, incredibly, kind of didn't do a lot with this information. They believed it was some sort of ploy, which, to be honest, it did seem a little too good to be true. They kind of believed it was maybe meant to throw them off the scent, so it sort of reinforced their original aim. So then the Germans settled on what's become kind of the famous scythe through the Ardennes, where they concentrated all of their mechanized units, in contrast to the French, into a single formation, drove them through this territory that was seen as being largely impassable. The French general who had labeled it as such was, of course, none other than Philippe Pétain, who said that it would be that the territory the Ardennes didn't need to be defended. It could defend itself. It would be impossible to move a large force through it. And so they aimed to split the French and British army by driving through the Ardennes, pushing not towards Paris, but instead to the English Channel, destroying the Allied armies that were surrounded in Belgium, and then finishing off what remained of the French army. It was seen as an enormous gamble, but it was also seen as the only possible way that they could keep the war short and winnable.
Why were they able to do that? Like, despite everyone thought that you wouldn't be able to go through the Ardennes with tanks, and they were able to do that. That's something I've never understood.
It sort of became almost a self-fulfilling prophecy, I think. to the point that it would only be lightly contested. The Belgians had a single division, troops that were mostly bicycle mounted, to cover that large territory. That was actually very common at the time. You laugh, but actually all of the armies did that. Every German division had a company of cyclists for reconnaissance. But yeah, the Belgians had entire divisions of cyclists, 10,000 men on bicycles.
Wow.
The Chasseurs Ardennais. But yeah, they were basically just meant to serve as a delaying force and to fall back towards the city of Liège, which was sort of the linchpin of the Belgian defensive lines. So they felled a couple trees here and there to block the roads, but didn't seriously contest the German invasion when it came. The French sent a couple cavalry units into the Ardennes, again, to just kind of serve as a blocking force. These were mostly still horse-mounted cavalry, which was still not a huge part of the French army, but still an extant part of the French army at that time. A little bit archaic and kind of shows the gap in technological development there. But, I mean, the Germans also did send a significant force crashing through Belgium, and it was enough to convince the Allies that this really was the main blow, and that made them unwilling to quickly pull those troops and redeploy them. The other problem, and this is what really became catastrophic, is that this initial Allied plan wasn't too bad. The Belgian army was capable of covering most of the front line. You just needed the French First Army and the British Expeditionary Force to plug this gap between Brussels and Namur. The problem is that then, in the early months of 1940, there were more and more signs that the Germans would also invade the Netherlands. And the Allies began looking at ways to keep the Netherlands in the war in case of conflict, because they didn't want the Germans to gain control of the Dutch ports on the North Sea, and the Netherlands would provide useful bases for aircraft striking against Germany. So what was decided was that the French 7th Army, which was the designated reserve force, and it was mechanized to be able to move quickly and respond to a German breakthrough, was pulled from its position in reserve at the center of the French lines around Reims, and it was moved far over to the coast near Dunkirk with the idea that they would zip up the Channel coast to link up with the Dutch at the time when the Germans invaded. In the event, by the time they got there, historically the Dutch were already one day away from capitulating. They made very little serious contribution to the war, ended up having to fall back, and also got surrounded.
Yeah, the
Dunkirk.
Dutch capitulated in 1 week. Pretty impressive.
It's called the 5-day war in Holland. But yeah, and so this deprived the French of the quick reaction force they would have needed to respond to this German armored breakthrough when it came through the Ardennes. And so it was just a horrible strategic blunder. Many of the top French generals at the time were really nervous about it and told Gamelin the same, but for whatever reason, he was very stubbornly married to this idea. He was convinced that the main blow was coming through Belgium, convinced that a small French force would be able to stabilize the front with the Dutch and keep them in the war, and that the mobile reserve could be discarded with, and it would prove to just be a completely disastrous decision. Maybe more than leaving aside foresight, like once the war had actually started, probably the single most disastrous strategic decision made by any leader on the Allied side.
Why did they think Holland had a chance?
So the Dutch actually had a plan called Fortress Holland. And, for those familiar with the Netherlands, it's cut up by all these rivers and canals and a land of many bridges. The Dutch had basically prepared a lot of these canals for defensive purposes. They'd built forts and bunkers at the key bridges, and they had the idea basically that the southern part of the Netherlands, which runs up against Belgium, would basically be abandoned. And the Dutch army would fall back behind the Meuse River, behind the different canals, and they would be able to defend the major cities, Rotterdam, Amsterdam, Utrecht, because tanks can't swim effectively.
Which, by the way, this has been the Dutch strategy against foreign invasion for hundreds of years. They famously did this in the war with Spain. Yeah, didn't work then, though.
No, in part because the Germans launched what was at that time the single largest parachute invasion that probably the first parachute invasion that was ever attempted. I can't think of anything that would have come before. And they, using gliders and parachutes, landed a large number of troops around Rotterdam and The Hague, threw the entire Dutch defensive plan into confusion. The army units that were in the southern Netherlands were overrun by the fast-moving Germans before they could fall back behind the rivers. And then finally, of course, the German Air Force infamously flattened the historic center of Rotterdam after the Dutch refused to surrender. And so the Dutch government, fearing that their cities would simply be annihilated from the air, which they had no means to defend against, ultimately capitulated.
That's why Rotterdam looks the unfortunate way it does today.
Yep.
But that's cool, Liam.
Although I guess worth noting, and this will become significant later, is that the Dutch army capitulated, the Dutch state did not. The Queen of the Netherlands fled to England along with the gold reserves, along with several of the Dutch cabinet ministers, and they set up a government in exile in London. So where does that leave us on our timeline? I guess I should have mentioned we had one other event before, sorry, we're jumping back a couple months, before the German invasion of France and Belgium and the Netherlands in May. That was May 10th, 1940. In April, they invaded Denmark and Norway. And so there was an Allied intervention in Norway of French, British, and actually Polish troops. Worth mentioning that about 20,000 Poles who had fled Poland, along with Poles who were living abroad in France, were organized into an army in exile in France and fielded a few different divisions. And a lot of these guys would later flee to the UK and would carry on the war as the Polish Home Army, or whatever they were called. But yeah, so we had a couple of events. In March, you had, simultaneous to all of this drama, the Soviet Union invaded Finland. Absurdly, the French and British very seriously looked at intervening in that conflict on the side of the Finns.
Incredible.
Yeah, I guess it's worth... The phony war was so weird, because it was going on for months. It was... the guys were just sitting there, they were waiting for the blow to come, and it just wasn't coming. It caused serious morale issues, and you had cases of guys kind of cracking up psychologically, waiting for this battle that was just never happening. In the meantime, the Supreme Allied War Council, as it was called, the meeting of the French and British governments and their top generals, were plotting different ways that they could, fight the Germans. And because the Germans were so materially dependent on the Soviet Union at this time, the conversation began to wander. There was one brilliant scheme of using bombers based in French Syria to fly over Turkey without asking and bomb the Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus to prevent the Soviets from supplying the Germans with fuel. Thank God they didn't do that.
That would have been pretty bad down the line.
Yeah, that insane to even think of. Insanely, there was a lot of pressure, especially from the Tory government, which was still incredibly led by Neville Chamberlain, the architect of appeasement at Munich during this period, who still hated the Soviet Union. So when the Soviets invaded Finland, wanted to look at ways of aiding the Finns. And they did actually form the Scandinavian Expeditionary Corps for such a purpose. That war ended in any event before it could intervene. Again, thank God. This did lead to the downfall of the French Prime Minister at that time, called under the Third Republic, the Président du Conseil, President of the Council, Edouard Daladier. He was replaced by Paul Reynaud, who I mentioned previously, who was a big anti-German politician, a figure of the center-right, we would say more. His party was not... He was to the right of the radicals. I forget what his party was in particular. But he was still involved in these governments with the socialists, with the radicals.
If you're an anti-German politician, this is your time to shine, yeah.
Right. So anyway, that Scandinavian Expeditionary Corps would be sent to Norway, and then they would be hastily evacuated back to France as the situation unfolded there. But either way, worth mentioning the change in command at the top of the French government. And actually, for reasons related to Norway, I forget the exact cause, it was the day before the Germans invaded France is actually when Winston Churchill succeeds Neville Chamberlain as British Prime Minister as well. So you have a near simultaneous change in leadership on both sides.
That brings us to the actual invasion, right?
Yes.
La France est une chose, à mes yeux, très considérable. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. Je veux dire par là qu'à mon sens, elle est quelque chose très grand. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. Il y a même là quelque chose d'extraordinaire. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. Il faut que la France joue son rôle, c'est exact. Et pour qu'elle joue son rôle, il faut qu'elle soit la France.